The carriage doors slammed shut, and the cobbled streets of Madrid echoed with the sound of hooves and wheels. Inside, Charles, the young Prince of Wales, sat nervously, his heart pounding. He had come to Spain on a secret mission, one that could change the course of history. His eyes darted to the gap in the curtains, where he could glimpse the outside world. The crowds were thick, pressing against the coach, eager to catch a glimpse of the mysterious visitor. Charles could feel the tension in the air. He was supposed to be incognito, but somehow the people had figured out who he was. They shouted, "God bless him," and showed such affection that his guards had to push them back, making way through the throng. It was a chaotic scene, and Charles felt a mix of excitement and fear. As the coach finally pulled up to the House of the Seven Chimneys, the British Embassy, Charles took a deep breath. He was here to meet the Infanta Maria Anna, the daughter of King Philip IV of Spain. This was no ordinary courtship. It was a political alliance that could bring peace and prosperity to both England and Spain. But first, he had to find the Infanta. Endymion Porter, a trusted friend and advisor, had told Charles that the Infanta would be easy to spot. She would be wearing a blue ribbon around her arm. Charles scanned the crowd, his eyes searching for that distinctive blue. Suddenly he saw her. She was beautiful, with a serene and regal bearing, and the blue ribbon tied around her arm made her stand out. For a moment, Charles felt a surge of hope. Maybe this mission wouldn't be as impossible as he feared. The next day, Charles and George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham, were summoned to a meeting with the King of Spain. They were taken to the Prado, a grand promenade in Madrid, where they were to meet the king. As they walked, George whispered, "Remember, we're here to make a good impression. Everything depends on this." The meeting was arranged with all the pomp and ceremony of the Spanish court. King Philip IV, a tall and imposing figure, arrived with his entourage. He was dressed in fine clothing, his cloak thrown over his face, and he carried a sword and a buckler. When he entered the room, the atmosphere grew even more tense. Charles and George bowed deeply, and the king greeted them with a mixture of curiosity and formality. "Welcome, Prince Charles," King Philip said, his voice rich and authoritative. "It is an honor to meet the son of King James of England." Charles, with Endymion Porter translating, replied, "I am deeply grateful, Your Majesty. I have come to seek a lasting friendship and alliance between our two great nations." The king nodded, and the conversation continued with a series of polite exchanges. Philip was particularly interested in Charles's journey across France to Madrid. He seemed impressed, though a bit puzzled by the young prince's boldness. As the meeting drew to a close, the king invited Charles to a grand celebration the following week, a public welcome to the city. The celebration was a spectacle of grandeur. Hundreds of prisoners were released, including some Englishmen who had been caught as pirates. The next day, Charles was given 2 horses to choose from for the procession into the city. He spent time admiring them, trying to decide which one to ride. In the end, he chose the less magnificent horse, a gesture of humility that impressed the king. On Sunday, the day of the procession, the streets of Madrid were adorned with rich hangings and intricate decorations. Charles and George were escorted to the monastery of San Geronimo, where they joined King Philip for a meal. After the meal, Charles was introduced to the various councils and officials of the Spanish court, a long and formal process that left him exhausted but proud. The royal party then mounted their horses and set off for the city. A large canopy of rich tissue, lined with crimson cloth of gold, was unfurled to shield the kings from the crowd. The streets were filled with people, and at various points there were performances by comedians, dancers, and musicians. The procession was a grand display of Spanish wealth and power, designed to impress the visitors. When they arrived at the Alcazar, the royal palace, Charles was greeted by Queen Elizabeth of France, King Philip's wife. She conducted them to a room where 3 equal chairs were set up beneath a cloth of state. The queen sat in the center, with Charles and the king on either side. The room was lavishly decorated, and the walls were lined with a living tapestry of ladies, noblemen, and children, all dressed in their finest. After the formalities, Charles was shown to his opulent apartments in the palace. The queen presented him with a series of gifts, including a large basin of gold, a beautifully embroidered nightgown, and trunks filled with delicate linens and perfumes. The celebrations continued for 3 nights, with fireworks lighting up the sky and torches illuminating the windows of Madrid. Despite the grandeur, Charles and George were aware of the political stakes. James, Charles's father, had broken off diplomatic relations with the Holy Roman Emperor over the Palatinate, and the success of their mission now depended on Spanish mediation. They felt the weight of the world on their shoulders, but they were determined to succeed. In the midst of all the festivities, the Infanta seemed almost invisible. Charles was allowed only brief glimpses, and each time she maintained a formal and distant demeanor. The Spanish court was playing a game, using Charles's desire to see the Infanta as a tool to push for religious concessions. Charles was frustrated, but he knew he had to play along. One evening, as Charles was settling into his apartment, he wrote a letter to his father, James. "Here am I, now in a chamber alone," he wrote. "The Infanta is a vision of beauty, but elusive. I must be patient and show my sincerity. The future of our nations depends on this." As the days passed, the negotiations continued, and the stakes grew higher. Charles and George knew that their mission was far from over, and the challenges ahead were many. But for now, they were caught up in the spectacle and the promise of what could be. The scorching summer heat in Spain didn't cool down the tensions between Charles and the Spanish. On April 24th, King Philip arranged a meeting with Charles and a panel of Catholic theologians. The meeting took place in one of the king's private chambers. Philip greeted Charles but quickly left, saying he couldn't listen to anything against the Catholic faith. This made the atmosphere even more tense. George had already been part of 2 secret discussions about heresy, Catholic toleration, and the authority of the Pope compared to James as the head of the Church of England. This was Charles's first time being questioned on these matters. Charles claimed there was nothing to discuss because he was firm in his faith. The mood got worse when a Spanish monk quoted a verse from the Gospel of Luke, suggesting that Charles needed to convert to Catholicism to be accepted by Christ. Charles asked for the verses to be repeated in French, realizing the implication. George, who was there, got so angry that he threw his hat to the ground and stormed out of the room. Tensions escalated, and George refused to attend more meetings arranged by Villiers, the Spanish minister. Villiers, in turn, stopped Charles from seeing the Infanta. Charles, determined to break the deadlock, decided to make a bold move. He learned that the Infanta often visited a summer house in the Casa de Campo to collect dew from plants, believed to have medicinal properties. On May 17th, Charles, with Endymion Porter as his interpreter, went to the summer house. He was let into the garden, but told the Infanta was in the orchard, which was locked. Charles found a ladder, climbed the wall, and jumped down. When the Infanta saw him, she screamed and ran away. An elderly marquis, acting as her guardian, begged Charles to leave, warning that he risked his life by being there. Charles left, feeling humiliated. As the summer heat intensified, the negotiations slowed down. It became clear that the Spanish wanted Charles to convert to Catholicism, something Charles would never do. James's ambassador, Digby, had misled Villiers by suggesting conversion was possible, which only made things worse. The situation was further complicated by the issue of Charles's sister, Elizabeth. The Spanish court showed little sympathy for her and her husband, Frederick, who had lost to a Catholic army. This made the English camp even more despondent. Back in England, James had offered George a dukedom, a title usually reserved for royalty. George initially resisted, fearing jealousy from his rivals, but James insisted. The patent for the dukedom arrived in Madrid in late May, and George wrote a grateful letter to James, calling himself "Your poor Steenie" as Duke of Buckingham. Despite George's new title, the negotiations continued to stall. The Spanish court's complex procedures and the Vatican's involvement made any progress seem impossible. George called the Spanish court a labyrinth, where they had been entangled for years. While the negotiations dragged on, Charles and George had time to explore the opulence of the Spanish court. They wandered the cool marble corridors of the Alcazar, admired the vast art collections, and attended bullfights and fiestas. Charles bought several paintings, including works by Titian, and commissioned Velázquez to sketch his likeness. They also visited the Escorial, a massive palace dedicated to St. Lawrence, and arranged for exotic animals to be sent back to England. The contrast between the grandeur of the Spanish court and the modesty of the English court was striking. Charles and George saw what they could have had, and what they were about to lose as the negotiations neared collapse. Meanwhile, in London, George's spies at Wallingford House kept him informed of the latest rumors and political developments. The city buzzed with news of a papal dispensation that would allow the Infanta to marry a Protestant prince. James received the dispensation in a sealed box, and George and Charles asked him to keep the conditions secret to avoid controversy. Speculation ran wild, and rumors spread about the conditions the Pope might have set. Some guessed that James would have to renounce his title as Defender of the Faith and grant full toleration to Catholics. James Hay, the Earl of Carlisle, arrived from France and made a brief visit to Madrid. His silence about what he had learned added to the mystery and speculation. As the rumors continued, a rift opened between George and Sir John Digby. Digby was excluded from the negotiations, and George and Charles became more disillusioned with the Spanish. James Hay had to present himself to the Infanta through the French court, rather than as James's envoy, highlighting the growing tensions. The Spanish match seemed more uncertain than ever, and the English camp was left to wonder what the future held. The air in England was thick with tension, as news spread about the growing tolerance of Catholicism. King James had promised the Protestant members of Parliament that the Spanish match between his son, Prince Charles, and the Spanish Infanta would not mean the spread of Catholicism. He assured them that the laws against those who didn't attend Protestant worship, known as recusants, would remain in place. However, under a secret deal with Spain, James was allowing Catholics to worship privately in their homes. This news leaked out, and a sense of betrayal and unrest began to rise. Puritans, who were radical Protestants, were especially vigilant. They spoke of Romish foxes coming out of their hiding places. Debates between Catholics and Protestants seemed to be officially encouraged, and Jesuits, once seen as the front-line soldiers of Catholicism, were now preaching openly. In the Midlands, a man who had served as a priest in Spain during Queen Elizabeth's time was seen parading around in episcopal vestments, pretending to be a Catholic bishop. Londoners couldn't miss the new Catholic chapel being built near St. James's Palace, a clear sign that Charles's bride, the Infanta, was on her way. George's own family added to the fears. His mother, Mary, had openly converted to Catholicism, and there were suspicions about his wife, Kate, and her father, the Earl of Rutland. People were worried that the uneasy peace established by Elizabeth and continued by James was crumbling. The match with Spain seemed to be a threat to the Protestant settlement. In May, rumors spread that a deal on the Spanish match was close, and Charles was about to return with his bride. A fleet was being prepared to fetch them, including the magnificent 1,500-ton ship, the Prince Royal. The ship was being readied with a luxurious cabin for the Infanta, decorated with gold and velvet. 3 vice-admirals, all suspected of being Catholics, were appointed to lead the fleet, including George's father-in-law, the Earl of Rutland. Senior members of the Privy Council were sent to Southampton to organize the reception for Charles and his bride. Meanwhile, James ordered that special honors be shown to the Marquis of Hinojosa, who was coming from Madrid. Hinojosa, with his disfigured face and casual demeanor, stopped in Canterbury, where some people declared themselves Catholics, raising fears of a Catholic uprising. A Dorchester merchant noted the busy traffic of important people between London and the western ports, and heard a rumor that the fleet had mutinied, with the Protestant crew refusing to sail under Catholic leadership. The Wallingford House circle, concerned about the gossip and speculation, warned George to try to delay the Spanish match. They told him to stand with the people as well as the king, as popular opinion was turning against the match. They warned that if the negotiations continued, it could ruin his position in the government and the country. On June 14th, Francis Coddington, Charles's secretary, arrived in Greenwich with a letter from Charles and George. The letter was so sensitive that James burned it after reading it, but it clearly contained news that shocked him deeply. In Madrid, George and Charles had been in the city for 3 months, and their frustration was turning into reckless behavior. George was falling out with the Spanish court, and there were hints of a falling out between him and Charles. The Spanish were delaying the negotiations, and the crisis facing Charles's sister and her husband, Frederick, was worsening. George and Charles felt trapped and saw no way out. James responded by telling them to accept any terms that would secure their release. On July 7th, Charles agreed to the conditions set by the Spanish and the Vatican, including a pledge to stop enforcing laws against Catholics and to allow them to worship privately. Madrid celebrated with 3 days of fireworks, but the news in England was met with fear and anger. Despite the official celebration, George and Charles wrote letters to James as if the wedding was still going ahead. However, days before their scheduled departure, Charles wrote a secret note to James, warning that their letters had been intercepted by the Spanish ambassador, Hinojosa. George, recovering from a fever, wrote a humble letter to James, apologizing for his failings and expressing his eagerness to return to England. On September 1st, George sent another note, this time without Charles's knowledge, expressing his joy at the thought of seeing James again. They were at the Escorial, the Spanish royal palace, where Charles signed the documents appointing Philip to act as his proxy in the marriage. Philip gave Charles a valuable portrait by Titian of his great-grandfather, Charles V, a symbol of the hoped-for union between the two royal families. On September 18th, George and Charles finally set sail for England. The journey that had started as a romantic adventure had turned into a diplomatic fiasco. When they arrived in Plymouth on October 5th, they were greeted with a mix of relief and mockery. They made their way to London as quickly as possible, arriving to a city lit up with bonfires and ringing bells. The Archbishop of Canterbury, who had previously criticized the Spanish match, welcomed them into Lambeth Palace. The streets were filled with people, eager to see the returning prince and duke. George and Charles then headed to Royston, where James was staying, to report on their mission. The journey that began with high hopes and romantic ideals had ended in disappointment and uncertainty. The prince's return to England was a whirlwind of emotion and confusion. After a harrowing journey, the coach carrying Charles and George finally pulled up at Theobald's, where King James, their father, was waiting anxiously. The moment they saw each other, the king flew down the steps, and the three of them embraced, tears streaming down their faces. The king was overjoyed, and the air was filled with a sense of relief and happiness. Sir Edward Conway, the king's secretary, noted that the king's spirits had been lifted by the prince's return, and the affection between them seemed as strong as ever. However, the joy was short-lived. The royal family retired to the king's bedchamber, and the discussions that followed were intense and secretive. Those outside the door could hear the king's voice fluctuating from calm to loud, and sometimes they laughed, but other times they argued. When they emerged for supper, the king seemed more relaxed, but he made it clear that he was not willing to force a dishonorable marriage on Charles for the sake of his sister Elizabeth. Meanwhile, the country was in a state of confusion. The Privy Council announced that the marriage negotiations with Spain would continue as planned, and the Spanish ambassadors, Hinojosa and Coloma, were summoned to Royston. However, they were redirected to a small village, a clear snub that added to the mystery surrounding the king's intentions. The public was left to speculate, and rumors spread like wildfire. Some believed the marriage was off, while others thought it was just delayed. The situation was made even more complex by a tragic incident known as the Fatal Vesper. On the evening of October 26th, a floor in a building near the French embassy in Blackfriars collapsed during a Catholic service, killing over 90 people, including the preacher. This event was seen by many as a sign from God, with Puritan writers using it to argue against Catholicism. However, the fact that some of the victims were Protestants complicated the matter, and the king's lenient policies toward Catholics were called into question. Despite the confusion, the king was focused on welcoming Charles and George back. He was overjoyed to have his sons with him again, and the court was filled with a sense of celebration. However, tensions began to build as James persisted with the idea of a Spanish marriage, even after the humiliations Charles and George had endured. The king clung to the hope that Spain would help restore the Palatinate, but Charles and George, who had first-hand experience with the Spanish, knew this was unlikely. They had negotiated with King Philip and Olivares, and were convinced that Spain would never risk a war with the Holy Roman Empire over the Palatinate. The Spanish ambassadors, who had arrived since Charles's return, were given a somewhat chaotic reception at Whitehall. James met them briefly, and then escorted them to meet Charles. The prince received the letter from King Philip coolly, showing little of the enthusiasm he had displayed in Madrid. James, however, insisted on hosting a grand feast for the ambassadors, paid for by the royal exchequer. The feast was a spectacular event, with a lavish meal and a masque. but it was clear that George had arranged it more out of duty than genuine enthusiasm. As the weeks passed, the king's health and mood began to suffer. Thomas Erskine, a loyal servant, noted the toll the turmoil was taking on James. He wrote to the Earl of Mar, expressing concern about the king's gout and his mental state. The situation was so tense that Erskine wondered what the future held, especially for the younger generation. George, despite the mission's failure, was still praised for his actions in Madrid. He had faced difficult conditions, and had made the brave decision to return without a deal. Even those who had been critical of him, like Thomas Erskine, found themselves admiring his resolve. George's old mentor, Francis Bacon, reached out to him asking for help. Bacon, who had fallen from power and was in poor health, saw George as his last hope for a return to favor. George, in turn, welcomed Bacon back to York House, where the former Lord Chancellor had once lived. Bacon arrived at York House, looking frail and desperate. He had spent his years in exile writing books on politics, religion, and natural philosophy, but he was eager to be back in the king's court. George, who had always been supportive, listened to Bacon's plea and promised to help him. The two men, bound by a long history, discussed the challenges ahead, knowing that the road to resolving the Spanish marriage and the Palatinate issue would be long and difficult. As the snow fell heavily and the temperature dropped, the morning of Thursday, February 12, 1624, was marked by a sense of anticipation and unease. The day was supposed to see the grand opening of the new Parliament, a moment that promised to bring the kingdom's political tensions to a boiling point. But as the MP gathered at New Palace Yard, they received news that the opening had been postponed. The official reason was the harsh weather, but whispers of more sinister motives spread like wildfire. Ludovic Stuart, the Duke of Lennox and Richmond, arrived early, braving the cold to oversee the parliamentary proceedings. As a cousin of King James and a loyal member of the royal household, Ludovic was a familiar and respected figure. He decided to start the swearing-in process in the outer room of the Commons chamber, managing to swear in over 100 members before the harsh conditions forced him to delegate the task to 16 volunteers. Despite the delays, the atmosphere was tense. The Venetian ambassador noted the security concerns, wondering if the postponement was more than just a precaution against the weather. The MPs, shivering and restless, waited for the official word to return home or to find shelter. 4 days later, on the rescheduled opening day, the news of Ludovic's sudden death from a fit of apoplexy sent shockwaves through the court. King James, already fragile and isolated, was devastated. He postponed the Parliament once again, this time to the following week, as the royal household mourned the loss of a trusted and beloved figure. On February 19th, the day finally arrived. King James, dressed in his elaborate robes of state, was driven to Westminster in a chariot lined with purple velvet, pulled by 6 horses. Prince Charles followed on horseback, his presence a symbol of the growing bond between him and George Villiers, the king's favorite. The members of the Commons awaited the king's arrival in the Painted Chamber, a room rich with history and the weight of the kingdom's future. As Lionel Cranfield, the Lord Treasurer, began his welcoming remarks, a large section of plaster fell from the ceiling. The room erupted in chaos with cries of treason and traitors echoing through the chamber. Members scrambled for the doors, leaving behind cloaks, hats, and even weapons in their rush to safety. By the time King James arrived, the chaos had subsided. The MP were summoned to the bar of the House of Lords chamber to hear the king's opening speech. James, dressed in his regal finery, addressed the assembled members with a mixture of hope and caution. He spoke of the kingdom's challenges, the need for unity, and the importance of addressing the crisis in the Palatinate. His words, though carefully chosen, carried the weight of a king who felt his power slipping away. George Villiers, standing beside Prince Charles, listened intently. He had worked tirelessly to build a coalition of anti-Spanish supporters, but the path ahead was fraught with danger. The king's isolation was evident, and the growing rift between James and his son and favorite was a source of deep concern. George knew that the success of their plans depended on their ability to navigate the treacherous waters of court politics and to win the support of the Parliament. As the opening of the new Parliament marked a new chapter in the kingdom's history, the air was thick with the scent of change. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The bond between George and Charles had become a powerful force, one that could shape the fate of the kingdom. The king's words echoed through the chamber, but it was the unspoken alliance between the prince and his favorite that held the key to the kingdom's future.